Hi, thank you for accessing this overview of the TEA 2020 Non-Public Off-Campus Reintegration Guidance. This training is presented by the Texas Education Agency Division of Special Education Projects and Strategy, part of the Office of Special Populations and Monitoring. For accessibility, all spoken audio in this presentation is reflected in the notes section of each slide on the PDF of this presentation, which can be found on the TEA Non-Public website. During today's training, we will first review the state and federal requirements guiding reintegration planning protocols. Next, we will look at statewide areas of concern that TEA has identified from the last 2 years of reviewing reintegration plans as part of non-public monitoring. We will then go over the 5 reintegration planning steps. After that, we will look at the LEA's responsibilities for monitoring the reintegration plan once a student has been placed. You will have access to contact information on the last slide of this presentation if you have additional questions or concerns. Now we will quickly dive into the state and federal requirements governing TEA's reintegration guidance. You can follow the hyperlinks in this slide if you would like to access the original text of these requirements. First, Texas Academic Code specifies for both non-public residential placements and for off-campus day placements that the ARD committee must develop reintegration criteria and timelines when the student is placed. We will touch on this again in today's training, but these criteria must be developed prior to placement. We also need to keep in mind the IDEA principle of least restrictive environment. Placement in separate settings is only justified when the nature or severity of disability prevents the student from accessing the general education setting. It's important to note that there are also funding implications tied to reintegration planning. Texas Academic Code specifies that funding for non-public placements cannot be approved if the LEA has not developed individualized reintegration criteria and timelines for the student. Next, let's touch on a few statewide areas of concern when it comes to the development of reintegration plans. One area of concern statewide is behavior descriptors that are unobservable or unmeasurable. Make sure that you are using student baseline data to create criteria that can be observed and measured. Avoid subjective ideas like dangerous or disruptive or disrespectful, and use specific examples such as hitting or throwing objects. Another concern is the use of developmentally inappropriate criteria. Make sure you are identifying those behaviors that are preventing the student from accessing a free, appropriate public education on the home campus, even with a maximum level of support. Reintegration criteria should focus on developmentally appropriate replacement behaviors and coping strategies. Statewide, TEA is also seeing reintegration criteria outside the school day. For a student in a non-public placement, especially in the case of a residential placement, there might be high levels of support needed both inside and outside of the school day. The student and family may need the LEA's support in accessing appropriate outside resources to address out-of-school needs. However, criteria based on behaviors outside of the school day should not be used as a basis for initial or continuing non-public placement. Another frequently occurring concern is reintegration plans written after the placement ARD. These criteria must be developed prior to placement by a collaborative team who knows the student. The ARD committee should not wait until after the student adjusts to the new facility or otherwise delay reintegration planning. One final concern that is occurring statewide is moving target reintegration criteria. There should not be situations where the student meets reintegration criteria but remains at the facility because the ARD committee determines a higher level of mastery or stricter criteria are needed, or that the home campus cannot provide the level of support the student needs. As soon as a student is placed, the LEA needs to begin planning for the staffing and programming the student will need upon return, so that reintegration is not delayed. Now that we've reviewed legal guidance and some common concerns statewide, we are going to review the 5 reintegration planning steps. These steps are reflected in the recommended reintegration plan available on the TEA Nonpublic website. Here's a brief outline of the 5 reintegration planning steps. We will go into each step in more detail. Step 1 is to identify the observable, measurable behaviors that necessitate the student's placement in a non-public or off-campus setting. Step 2 is to identify the steps already taken by the LEA to meet the student's needs. Step 3 is to identify observable, measurable reintegration criteria and an estimated timeline. Step 4 is to identify the LEA's staff, facility, and equipment needs to support the student after reintegration. Step 5 is to describe the student and family's needs upon reintegration and link up with outside resources to support the family. The first step in reintegration planning is to present accurate baseline data. These are the observable, measurable behaviors that are the justification for a more restrictive placement. Here you will want to make sure you avoid vague or subjective descriptions of behavior, such as manipulative, disruptive, or disrespectful. Instead, you will want to use specific observable behaviors, such as kicking or biting, along with the frequency these behaviors are occurring. Make sure you prioritize the most significant behavior concerns, such as any behaviors that result in physical harm to the student or to others. An example of observable, measurable behaviors for a student with physical aggression as a primary area of concern might look something like this. In this example, we have observable descriptions of the behavior of concern: hitting with a closed fist, kicking, headbutting, attempted biting, and we have measurable frequency of the behaviors, average of 19 times per day, over a given time frame, 6-week period. In contrast, a non-example for the same student would be non-measurable subjective descriptions of behavior, such as does not get along, violent and manipulative, or she is a danger. The next step in reintegration planning is to identify the steps your LEA has already taken to meet the student's needs. Be specific about the services and supports provided. Include the frequency of interventions and the number of staff supporting the student. If you have completed any recent evaluations, include that information too. You can also list any outside resources the LEA and family has accessed, such as the CRCG. One item to note is that for all students placed in non-public or off-campus settings for reasons related to behavior, there should be a current FBA at least every 3 years, or more frequently if the functions of behavior have changed. In this example of steps taken by the LEA to meet the student's needs, we see specific examples of the services, settings, and supports provided. Self-contained setting, one-to-one teaching assistant, 3 to 5 staff to student ratio, alternate curriculum. There is also information about current evaluations, current FIE, new FBA, as well as outside supports provided to the student and family. respite care through non-educational funds, and local CRCG. However, in the non-example, there is no clear, measurable description of the supports attempted. There is no information about evaluations considered or about outside supports provided. The third step in reintegration planning is to identify observable, measurable reintegration criteria and an estimated timeline for reintegration. Remember that in addition to being observable and measurable, the criteria need to be developmentally appropriate and attainable. If there are multiple behaviors of concern, again, you should prioritize those behaviors that are limiting the student's access to free, appropriate public education on the home campus or creating a safety hazard for themselves or others. Also, think in terms of replacement behaviors and coping skills you would like to see the student develop, not just compliance or elimination of inappropriate behaviors. This example of a reintegration goal contains a time frame, 18 instructional weeks, conditions, given direct instruction in, an observable behavior, refusing tasks without hitting, kicking, or biting, and a measurable mastery level, 4 out of 5 opportunities, 3 consecutive weeks, no more than 3 verbal prompts. This criteria is age and developmentally appropriate and achievable for the student. In contrast, the non-example of a reintegration goal discusses a wait and see approach after the student is enrolled. The criteria of 0 instances for 2 semesters is likely not attainable or realistic for the student, and defiant or violent behavior is not measurable. The fourth reintegration planning step is to identify the LEA's staff, facility, and equipment needs to support reintegration. You might start by considering the staffing, physical space, and assistive technology currently offered to the student at the home campus. Then, consider the supports and services available to the student at the facility. Consider whether additional evaluations are needed to ensure appropriate services when the student returns. Also consider whether LEA staff working with the student need training specific to the student's needs. As soon as the non-public or off-campus placement is made, begin planning for any additional campus supports you will need upon reintegration. Also, identify specific crisis intervention protocols to support the student during behavioral or mental health crises and ensure appropriate LEA staff are trained in trauma-informed crisis intervention protocols. This example of LEA needs for reintegration includes the anticipated setting, level of staff support, assistive technology, and staff training. Non-examples of LEA needs would be statements implying that the LEA cannot, now or in the future, support the student. The final step in the reintegration planning process is to describe the student's and family's needs upon return to the LEA. Especially in the case of a residential placement, it is important to help the family secure outside resources to support a successful transition back to the home and community. The ARD committee can consider in-home or parent training as an IEP service. You can also consider using non-educational funds for additional home and community support for the student. Click the link in this slide for more information about appropriate uses for non-educational funds. Prior to placement, the LEA should also initiate collaboration with the local Community Resource Coordination Group, as well as the local Intellectual or Developmental Disability Authority or local Mental Health or Behavioral Health Authority. Links to these resources are available in this slide. The example of student and family needs upon reintegration includes in-district and outside resources to support the student and family in school and in the community. These will, of course, vary for each student. A non-example would include statements implying the students' and families' needs cannot be met now or in the future without non-public placement. The LEA's reintegration planning is not complete once the student is placed in a facility. Now that we have reviewed the reintegration planning steps, let's dive into the LEA's ongoing role in monitoring the reintegration plan during placement. First, we're going to investigate the LEA's role in reintegration plan monitoring during the student's facility placement. Then we will look at facilitating the student's return when the student is making progress towards reintegration, as well as next steps when the student is not making progress towards reintegration. During the student's non-public or off-campus placement, the LEA should ensure ongoing communication with the facility staff as well as the student and family. Responsibilities for ensuring the student is receiving a free, appropriate public education remain with the LEA during placement, so it is important for the LEA to monitor the student's progress towards reintegration criteria as well as IEP goals. The LEA needs to ensure that the IEP is being implemented as written at the facility. It is also important to monitor evaluation timelines and plan for any needed evaluations while the student is placed. Again, for a student in a non-public or off-campus placement due to behavioral needs, the FBA needs to be completed at least every 3 years or sooner if there is a change in the student's functions of behavior. While the student is placed, the LEA should make all necessary preparations to secure the staffing, facility, and equipment needed to provide appropriate services upon the student's return. Also, use this time to initiate or continue relationships between the LEA, the student and family, and outside supports such as a community resource coordination group, the local intellectual and developmental disability authority, or the local mental health or behavioral health authority. When the student is making progress towards reintegration, identify what's working. Are there programmatic features of the facility not yet reflected in the student's IEP that could inform the student's programming back at the LEA? Does the student need additional evaluations to be eligible for assistive technology or other services upon return? When reintegration criteria are close to being met, collaborate with the facility and the student and family to coordinate the student's return to the LEA. Would the student benefit from a gradual transition or opportunities for campus visits prior to the change of placement back to the home campus? Sometimes, though, you might find that the student is not making progress towards reintegration criteria or IEP goals while in a non-public or off-campus placement. In that situation, it is important to first ensure the IEP is being implemented with fidelity at the facility. If IEP implementation is assured, the ARD committee may wish to consider the need for additional evaluations, such as an FBA if new behaviors of concern are not reflected in the current FBA and BIP. If, after ensuring IEP implementation, considering new evaluations and revising the IEP, the student is still not progressing towards reintegration or IEP goals, the ARD committee may wish to consider whether the current placement is appropriate for the student and whether a change of placement is needed. Thank you for taking this opportunity to learn more about reintegration planning for Texas students placed in non-public or off-campus facilities. Please refer to the contact information in this slide if you have additional questions about non-public or off-campus placement or reintegration planning. The non-public placement notification and application website has additional reintegration planning resources, including the reintegration guidance document and sample reintegration planning form. The non-public team is also available by email at the address listed above. Thank you.